and Taiwan for its microchips. I wonder what each of you think about that specific example and how government and business should respond. And then maybe more broadly from that, if Taiwan is just an example. I don't know if you want to take that first, Kunal.
Yeah, happy to start with that. So I think there are two aspects. One is the actual domestic capability to produce semiconductors of the types that were used. And in the UK, we have some success stories of ARM and Graphcore. And in the US, obviously, is the passing of the CHIPS Act to try and bolster domestic capability. But the other aspect that we focus on in government is what is the bilateral and multilateral collaboration you can develop to actually build resilience on semiconductor supply. And the same actually applies to other aspects of where we are exposed in critical minerals as well. So I think it's a bit of both. We can't expect everything to be onshored and domesticated. We're not going to each have our own autarkic economic system. So instead, and harks back to one of the very first panel, the advantage and upside of our democratic open society alliances is that by invitation we can build that resilience and share the cost burdens between us.
Kevin, do you want to?
Well, I think Kunal was absolutely on the point there. We have got into that situation of reliance on Far East semiconductor manufacturer for some very good reasons over time. They've been extremely effective at it. They've had a labour force, manufacturing techniques that produce high reproducibility of quality. They are a good supplier. So to enter that marketplace, there's an extremely high bar to cross. So in the short term, clearly ensuring that the sources of supply are as resilient and politically appropriate as we can make them, while we actually start to look at alternative sources, is quite important. But I think here there then becomes an interesting economies of scale debate in that, we've talked very much about transatlantic collaboration today, and even the might of the defence industries of Europe and America, are still in certain commodity areas a very small purchaser in comparison with the wider commercial marketplace. And volume speaks volumes in this regard. So I think it's commendable that the governments of Europe and indeed the US are starting to look at this issue. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that it's quite a difficult market to enter, but probably the rewards will outstrip the costs and the effort required to do it. So a greater resilience is needed, and that's part of it, dual sourcing.
Thank you. Craig?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the bar being high, Kevin, and the CHIPS Act seemed like a large amount of investment, just over 50 billion US dollars. If you take the announced plans for expansion from the top 4 chip manufacturers, it's actually 10x that. It's over $500 million, so $500 billion that they've committed to be building over the next 2 to 3 years to resolve the current crisis. So the scale that we're talking about is enormous. I think there's, with a lot of talk of reshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, just the sheer complexity of the chip supply chain is almost befuddling, both on the equipment side and on the material side. There are some components within the chip manufacturing process. Some seem very mundane. If you take valves, for example.
Valves.
Surely valves. Yeah, valves can be difficult, but when you're doing it in a very high tolerance requirement environment with very low contamination, turns out there's one valve manufacturer who accounts for 80% of the semiconductor equipment kind of market. So it's fairly, if you want to replicate skills like that in the US and the UK through the alliance, it's going to take a long time to develop those skills. And when you look at that across, whether it's just the valves, the equipment, the lithographic dimensions, it's a gargantuan task to build a self-reliant supply chain for that. So I'm not sure I would see it ever becoming totally domestic. I think there is going to have to be a significant degree of collaboration given the size and the complexity.
Thank you. Kunal, you mentioned minerals earlier, and it's very much known that China has been investing in Africa for a very long time with a view to sort of securing supplies of some of these rare earth minerals. I don't know if that's a good example of the kind of geopolitical risks that we should be concerned about, and I'm wondering what we do to mitigate them.
Yeah, I think that is a good example of the geopolitical risk. And in terms of what we do as government to mitigate it, is pulling on those levers of allies and partnerships. So we have something, the Mineral Security Partnership, US, UK, European partners, but also Japan and others. And its purpose is to actually understand those risks and understand what we can do to mitigate them. And there are different elements. One is actually just mapping and understanding where are the mines, where are the minerals. The second is actually where are the investment flows and who is actually investing where to extract that. And other elements are actually pushing higher standards of transparency as well as ESG into the mining of these. Now, that is the role as government, I think, is to facilitate and share that information, and then also bringing industry into that, because industry have been ahead of the curve at understanding where these minerals are.
Thank you. Craig, and then Kevin, what are your thoughts about the risk areas?
I think building on that, I agree with Kunal. I think China in particular have been very good at economic diplomacy. So not only controlling their own kind of mineral and other production, but also moving across some other areas of Southeast Asia and particularly Africa. So I worry they're sewing up quite a lot of supply in other territories as well as just China.
Kevin.
And this is where industry, are clearly best placed to make their own policy decisions. Clearly, we're governed by sanctions rules as delivered by governments, which is almost the first instance you have to respond to. So the switch from, for example, Russian titanium sourcing to European, North America, Canada sourcing, is a lever you throw very quickly. Clearly, there are allowances made for the speed of that by governments, gratefully, but certainly from an Airbus Defence and Space perspective, we have now switched completely titanium sourcing to Europe, Africa, and North America, and as a decision. And then you follow that on with your logical source A, source B solutions, which distance you from less direct but more profound trade challenges to the supply chain over time. So I think we're seeing that sort of switch is now practically happening in a number of industries, because this has been a very recent set of serious shocks where a global reliance on sole sourcing just simply is not a sustainable strategy anymore.
Yeah, thank you for a very specific example. Kunal, you wanted to come back in.
Just to touch on this point about what China has done well actually in its geo-economic influence, and I think they went very large with the Belt and Road Initiative, and through their EPC state-owned enterprises offer tons of cash and the ability to build these large pieces of infrastructure and mines as well. But then in the recent years, you've obviously seen the pushback politically, debt diplomacy. You've seen Malaysia tear up a bunch of contracts last year, and actually there's a domestic concern in China about the financial viability of the countries. I think in response to that, I find it inconceivable there is not a very attractive Western offer to actually, let's say, develop mines or develop infrastructure. We're in New York, in the US, it's the largest capital market in the world. We've got UK as well, and then European allies. Biden has made his announcement and committed cash to the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. I feel there's an enormous opportunity actually to collaborate across Western partners to provide that finance, the professional services, and actually unlock minerals in a sustainable way that benefits local economies and development as well.
Well, you've raised what was going to be my next question, which is, do the right conditions exist for a kind of collaborative approach by US, UK, European partners to absorb these risks? You're saying they do.
I think I've answered yes, so I think there definitely is. And it's difficult. It's of course difficult. There are trillions sat in negative rate assets, or at least as of a few months ago. And it's very hard to deliver infrastructure in emerging and developing countries, but together with the multilaterals, that should not be impossible to do. There is demand for long-term investable assets with high returns. It's the jobs of government to structure that in a way and use our levers to mitigate the risk, currency risk, political risk, economic risk.
Kevin? And then Craig.
Agree. There's clearly a role for government in creating the circumstances for industries across the Atlantic Alliance to collaborate. So,
what would you need to see?
Correct approach to tariffs, the ease by which you can make those agreements, no political or other forms of impediment. So I think we have a long-standing relationship as part of the UK-US alliance to actually sort of further that. But I think this situation has just brought a new focus to another aspect of that and what collaboration actually means. It is absolutely collaborating across both the design, development, material sourcing and manufacture. It's not actually simply selling one thing to one country or one thing to another. It's actually being joint in that. Because I return to a point I made slightly earlier, the defence market, or indeed even the aerospace more widely market, is still a relatively modest consumer compared with the wider marketplace for consumer goods and that like. So economies of scale are another driver on why you should collaborate more.
Craig, what are your thoughts on this? Because one senses that despite the idea that in theory, yes, we could all do this, it feels like there's a lot of political division between a lot of these nations at the moment.
I think there is, and from a making it work perspective, there has to be something in it for both the alliance and for the partners. And even between developed nations, we see a lot of discussion on what's in it for me. So sometimes it manifests as offsets. We will let you, or we will buy this from you if you contribute this to the economy in different ways. So I don't think it's in the Chinese model of you have come in, you have take the assets and just a little bit of infrastructure. I think it needs to be a lot more than that.
So do you have thoughts, maybe you first, Craig, and then Kunal, about how governments can improve dialogue with businesses and work together both at a sort of intergovernmental level and then with businesses to mitigate the impact of the kind of geopolitical instability we're talking about?
Yeah, so we've heard a couple of comments earlier about the kind of organised nature or preference of governments and Ministry of Defence. There's something about speed and pace of decision making around kind of designs and programs that will come, not going as far as the kind of fail fast mentality in Silicon Valley, but something about the speed and pace of decision making, I think, would really kind of help to build trust on the commercial side.
Thank you. Kunal?
Yeah, I think it's a bit twofold, and it all comes back to our ability to risk monitor, stress test, and understand where the next vulnerability is. On the one hand, effectively the commercial arm of government, we get involved helping on a micro basis, specific company, specific issues, trying to understand where the pain points and pressures are. And a very good example, which would have been very hard to predict, was supporting a UK supplier, Kendamil, to bring infant formula to the US. Executive approval.
Infant formula.
It would have been very hard to have predicted that a year ahead of it happening. And instead, you work with business to understand and you respond as quickly as you can. I think where it is possible to do the stress testing and the macro risk analysis, where is the next vulnerability, that's where it's critical to work with business. It would have been obvious energy and grain with Russia and Ukraine. But I think with a forward look and forecast horizon, I think that's where we're dependent on players in the market who will see it first on their balance sheet and in their margins where the pressures are coming.